This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, so today's seminar, we're going to be talking about media events, national identity and retrospection. And I think particularly it could be argued that sort of two events, one very much media event, the other one kind of a slightly more concrete event, you know, with a slightly more clear setting and time span, which bookended the New Labour era, arguably. Although both did actually occur under Conservative governments, but nonetheless, a kind of either side of that kind of period, and that kind of maybe see if you two agree with me on this, but a kind of liberal left or slightly liberal left kind of idea of national identity, which is kind of linked with both of these two events. So we're talking about Britpop and the Olympics, and our two speakers today are Claudia Lueders from Royal Holloway and Sandra Tavares from King's College. And we're starting with Claudia. So Claudia's just submitted her PhD, which she's undertaken in the Politics and International Relations Department at Royal Holloway. And Claudia's done her PhD on national identity and nostalgia and Britpop. And her paper today is entitled, "Do You Know What I Mean? The Importance of Cultural References in Britpop and its Related Media Discourse." So two speakers are going to speak for half an hour each, and then we'll have questions at the end. Okay, thank you, sir. Claudia.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to present my paper here. As Dian already mentioned, it's based on my PhD, so I'm kind of splitting the paper in one, putting it into context of my research, and the other one actually talking about my empirical work and what I'm trying to turn into a journal article at some point. So, do you know what I mean? The importance of cultural reference in Britpop and its related media discourse. So for all of you who might be familiar with Britpop and Oasis, know that in the title already is a cultural reference to a song from Oasis. Do you know what I mean? And this is exactly the point I'm trying to make in this paper today, to show the importance of cultural referencing in Britpop and the impact of it on national identity.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
carry on.
Okay. So my starting point for my thesis was actually how national identity is constructed and reproduced through national identity in popular music, and I kind of wanted to do it on Britpop because I think it's a really unique case which appeared in the 90s, and I was really interested what Britpop's representation of national identity can tell us actually about British youth and their attitude towards their nation in the 90s. And given the fact that Britpop is very often closely associated with nostalgia, I was interested why that is, given the fact that it's actually produced and consumed by quite young people. So this is the starting point for my thesis. And as you know, national identity in the context of the United Kingdom is really complex. So you have the four nations, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, which in itself is really complex. And then you have from the 50s, 60s onwards, the migration aspect coming in. So you have non-white population, so it's a multi-ethnic and social-cultural society. And at this point, I would like to add that this is clearly depending on where you're actually growing up. So if you're growing up in an urban environment, you're more likely to come close with non-white population than probably in a rural or suburban environment. This might be changing now according to social data, but it's clearly, given the fact, it's clearly more diverse. The 90s were a particular interesting period because you have the fall of the Berlin Wall, you have the end of the Cold War, so there's a lot of things going on around in the world, and this is clearly having an impact on national identity. So people felt that globalization, Americanization, and Europeanization was increasing, and that kind of fed to anxiety for people in different nations and in the UK as well. And in addition to those external kind of aspects, you have internal ones going on. You have the Scottish and Welsh devolution movements, where you had the referendums in 79, but there is a lead up to the new referendums in 97. And there's quite a lot of social political changes going on. And you have the political change from conservatism to New Labour. And at this point, as Diane already mentioned, I would like to highlight that Britpop actually happened under a conservative government, even though it's always associated with Tony Blair and with Noel Gallagher coming to 10 Downing Street. So Britpop, the way I look at it and the time frame I was looking at it, is happening at the beginning to the mid-90s. So Britpop, that's a really interesting term. So the way I see it, I think it's not a music genre in itself. I think it's more a music journalist invention. I'm following kind of the definition of Bennett and Stratton, saying it's an indie guitar-based melodic pop music, but I'm especially highlighting that it's musically and lyrically influenced by British bands. And they always make reference to the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, with a special focus on the 60s. Like you always hear the reference to the Beatles, the Kings, the Stones, the Who. But I find when you're looking more closely into how it's been covered in music journalism and how it's been covered in the mainstream press, you find references to the Jam and to the Smiths and to David Bowie as well. So I like to push that a little bit more than just the 60s reference. In terms of content, the songs are really focused on specific British themes and images. And in particular in the media coverage, there's a lot of focus on the class and regional identity. And they're really playing the class and regional accents. So you have the Mancunian and the Cockney accent, which is kind of presented in the Mockney accent, famous, used by Damon Albarn. And this plays a really big role in the whole kind of media discourse. There is a definition I kind of really like in the Encyclopedia of Rock History, and it defines Britpop as a soundtrack of a new generation of British youth, which celebrated and commented on their lives, their culture, and their cultural heritage. I do like it, but I would change this into a different order. I would say it started as a comment and turned into a celebration, which especially for some of the bands was really difficult, because Suede really wanted to make a comment on society, felt it just created this kind of comic around British identity. In terms of national identity, I'm a political scientist and I'm looking at concepts from Benedict Anderson and Michael Billig. I'm not quite sure who's familiar with them. I'm sure you've heard about them. One, Imagine Communities, looks into the construction of national identity, and it looks at the impact of books and newspaper. And I feel probably it makes sense to look at different forms of social communication. And I think music is a really important one, which plays an important role for young people in particular. And it is a special form of communication because you have the lyrics and the sounds. It works on very different levels, and it can be experienced alone and in a group, which means it creates a different sense of community if you listen to it in your room, and if you listen to it in Hyde Park, for example, the last time Blur played. So it's a very different impact on your sense of community. And then the second one, which I find really interesting, is the one from Michael Billig's Banal Nationalism. And that one looks more into how you reproduce already established nations. And he did quite a lot of analysis of newspapers as well. What I find missing the most in both of these theories is actually nobody's looking at young people and the role what young people play in constructing and reproducing national identity. And this is a gap which I'm trying to fill with my thesis. So how do young people take things from their culture, their cultural heritage on board, and what they decide to bring into the future? How do they use it to comment on contemporary society? In terms of academic literature on Britpop and national identity, there is not much out there. There is like this really big book on Britpop and the English music tradition from Bennett and Stratton, and there are a couple of journalists who wrote on it, but in terms of academic literature, this is like the key literature. And they define Britpop as an antidote to grunge music by the British music industry, which I find difficult, because if you think about when Blair came up with the idea to bring out Modern Life is Rubbish, that was completely like not accepted by their managers, because they said that's like economic suicide you're actually making. Everyone is going for grunge and you're trying to make a British kind of music style again. So that was quite taking a risk. But you cannot really say that there's like this united decision. They're all individual bands and everyone wants to sell their music, so there's quite a lot of competition going on as well. And then it's a critical reassurance of British popular music by the British music journalists, and I put this very famous cover from Select magazine where you can see Brett Anderson in front of the Union Jack. And that was quite controversial because I actually talked to the PR agent, and as Brett Anderson mentioned several times, they didn't know he's going to be put in front of the Union Jack. So the media was really going for this British thing. And you can see like both statements kind of represented. It says Yanks go home, so this is the antidote against the grunge movement, so we stand against the American music. And then you have the battle for the British or Britain, which is kind of reassuring like British music. Another definition that Britpop is only a representation of white male heterosexual Englishness is an interesting one, and I'm talking about that quite a lot more in my individual chapters, but I'm not going into detail today. I just put it in there. That is one way to define it. I think what's a lot more interesting is the definition from Hesmondijk, who said it's a flag-waving traditionalist view of British cultural identity. And I think that's only true to a certain extent, because I think they really wanted to make, as I said earlier, a comment rather than just to celebrate it. So in terms of my argument, I will argue in the following part that cultural references play actually an important role for the construction and reproduction of national identity in popular music, and the focus of Britpop on national identity, referencing suburban lifestyle, looking into class issues, into regional division, actually shows that the everyday life played an important role for young people in the 90s, and they actually really wanted to talk about those subjects. And the heavy use of cultural referencing in Britpop and its related media discourse created a really strong sense of nostalgia. But I think we need to look into a new reading of this nostalgia, because I think it's meant as a critique and not as going backwards to the 60s. And this is the point I'm trying to make in the next part of my paper. So what I did in my research, I looked at the lyrics very closely. What kind of cultural references do they make? I did look into the media coverage, so I looked into music journals, NME, Melody Maker, and I literally went through them and looked, how do they cover Britpop, how do they cover national identity, and I did a day analysis of the famous British heavyweight championship in between Blur and Oasis, because both bands decided to release their albums on the same date, and it was on the 10 o'clock news, and I think that's quite unique to have music covered in the 90s in that way. And I literally looked at all the mainstream papers, how they covered this particular day, like 3 days before and 3 days in after the event. And I have some examples in here. So the Evening Standard said it's the great British pop scrap, which based on the question, who will conquer the hearts of the nation? So it becomes a national issue, this fight in between the working class lads and the middle class boys, in between Blur and Oasis. And the Observer said, in true English fashion, the showdown is tinged with class warfare and the North and South divide. And this is what the media was driving for, putting it into a class kind of context and into the North-South divides, Manchester versus London. And then you have the Sunday Times. British bands have reinvented themselves, and this is suggesting that there must be something like British music tradition before, and they are linking themselves into this tradition. And referencing to Blur, they said they are the kings of British pop, and they have become the nation's sweethearts and our national band. And reference to Parklife, they say it's a British caricature, and it encapsulates everything we love about them and ourselves. And this is exactly what in the everyday life of ordinary people in Michael Billig's research on banal nationalism, he calls it deixis, using words like we and our. So this is how you connect them, and you drive really, so this is great British pop, and this is our nation, and this is how you connect them. And what I find when I was looking into this media coverage and into the lyrics, that there's a lot more in terms of regional and cultural references, which is a lot more unique, where you don't need to point out this is our nation, because members of the nation will know, because they grow into the nation. They know the books, they know the TV programs, they know the music which they are referencing to. So it's quite a sophisticated way to distinguish in between insider and outsider. And I do have in here 3 different examples. So when Blur released their Modern Life is Rubbish album, they released different press release photos. So they started with British Image 1, which shows Damon Albarn in a skinhead dress or attire, and you see the other ones in actually mod dresses. And I'm not quite sure if you can see it, but if the light is right, you can see a little kind of red bluish kind of shadow, which makes a reference to the British flag. And the way I interpret this picture, it's actually making a reference to British subculture. So you have skinhead, you have mod culture, and it's one way in representing British identity. This image didn't get good feedback from the press at all. It's been perceived as too nationalistic, as too racist. So they issued a second one, a black and white picture, interesting enough, and they show them in suits having a cup of tea in a really, they call it a tea party. That's British Image 2. So these are very different ways in portraying a nation, and this is the way how they played with the national identity imagery. In terms of what I said earlier, you have the lyrics and you have the sound. I found a really famous quote from Damon Albarn where he said, "It was me attempting to write in a classic English way and using kind of imagery and words which were much more modern. So it was a weird combination of quite nostalgic sounding melodies and chord progressions with these weird caustic lyrics about England as it was at the moment, the way it was getting the American refit." So he's making it clear, so he really wants to comment on society rather than celebrating it at the beginning when they start with this. The next one is actually a quote I found in one of the album reviews of Modern Life is Rubbish from Paul Mature, and he says it's an acoustic stroll through West London, which captures Blur in between Portobello Road and the Smiths. So this is what I mean in between, it's a regional and a cultural reference. So Regional, Portobello Road, and the Smiths. So it's so unique. So if you're not familiar with either or, you don't know what they're talking about. But everyone who is familiar, they know exactly. So this is British music. It's really specific in a way. And the way they're using it in the album reviews, so sometimes you have references to the bands, you have references to certain lyrics, you have references to just first names of famous bands. So you need to be an insider in order to get that. And I could see the difference in between the mainstream newspapers. I looked at American coverage of Britpop as well, and they had to explain a lot more of those references if they used them, and they used them a lot less than British newspapers actually did. Here we have the famous Noel Gallagher Union Jack guitar. Whenever I talk to musicians, journalists, or fans, this always came up, and they said they felt it was giving kind of pride back and actually using the Union Jack in not a racist way. So when Morrissey on stage, that was the example they always used. So when he used to wrap himself in the Union Jack or in the English flag, that was a no-go. But there was this development having this, that this was actually a playful use of the Union Jack and filling it with content. So saying we are creative, we have a great tradition of great British guitar music, and we are following this line. So they actually kind of made it in a positive way. And Noel Gallagher always referred himself back to the Beatles. So here's one quote using him, a Beatles reference, which every song that I write I compare to the Beatles. The thing is, they only got there before me. If I'd been born at the same time as John Lennon, I'd have been up there. So it's putting himself back in the tradition, but kind of saying what we are doing is new as well, it's innovative, and our thing is good and new as well. And I found that actually in all the press discussion, there was one thing really going for, they do make references to the past, so it's kind of reinventing a retro perspective, but on the other hand they always said, but they still have something new as well, which I find quite interesting. And there's another example of an album review from Paul Lester, and he said Oasis is a 19-stream hybrid of the Beatles and the Stones, with the best bits of the Roses and the Mondays thrown in. So he's actually not making just references to 60s bands, he's making references to more modern bands, the Happy Mondays and the Stone Roses. In terms, so I did quite a lot of interviews with Britpop fans as well, and it was interesting actually to see that they all followed the same discourse. So when I talked to musicians, so I did interviews with people from Ecobelly and Sleeper, and I got Brett Anderson actually answering some of my questions as well. So they actually said it was really important to them to talk about their own life and not about American lifestyle. They really wanted to find themselves. And this is exactly what I found in my interviews with journalists like John Harris, Paul Moody. They all had a strong need to point that out. And that's what I found in my fan interviews as well. So what I put here, I tried to make it as representative as possible for this quick paper. So I have one from England, one from Scotland, one from Wales. And I have different age ranges as well. So one probably the same age like the musicians, one might be the age of the fans, and then a quite new fan, 24 years old. And when we look at the first quote, Robert says that it was quite an exciting time when interesting music I could relate to came in from the margin and started getting a lot of attention and mainstream success. It was good to have something closer to my life than prom queens, jocks, and nerds, which seemed to be an obsession in US grunge and indie music. I think it was just time for something homegrown to be expressed and listened to after so much US cultural domination. the second part of this quote is even more interesting. It says, "I think that the music could appeal to young people anywhere in the UK and Ireland." So this is the unity. So there is no division in between the different nations. And he's making a cultural references. As Morrissey would say, there's no real difference between people in Carlisle, Dublin, Dundee, and Humberside as compared to Manchester and Dublin. So the cultural references to the Smiths song Panic, where you actually have a line like, "The music the DJ is playing is saying nothing to my actually life." So connecting himself to this kind of music of the past and using it to make a reference to what's going on in their culture right now is really interesting. In terms of the whole class debate, Matthew said, "The class obsession in the UK makes it appealing on a nationwide sense. Lyrics such as 'it is worth the aggravation to find yourself a job when's nothing worth working for' could easily apply to someone in London, Manchester, and he's interesting enough being Scottish, adding obviously Glasgow to include him into the loop." And the last one from Lear, a Welsh fan, he said, "Interesting one. Being Welsh, I tried to be diplomatic, so obviously showing a bit of distance. Some see it as a movement that made people proud to be British. For me, I could not stomach that crap. I just enjoyed the ride like anyone from mainland to Europe would have enjoyed it. Just I understood the psyche of the English media a little bit better, and so how Cool Britannia was a good play to make us feel British again." So even though he excludes himself being, or highlighting he's being Welsh, on the other hand he says to make us feel British again, so he's including them back again. And the last one is really interesting because he said you could never imagine a band from Spain or France producing an Oasis. They were arrogant, tough, and pissed off, and very, very sharp. So this is just like a really small portion of all the interviews I did, but you could see just a little reference to cultural references in here. And in terms of the next speaker, it was quite interesting to see when the Olympic Games were the closing ceremony called A Symphony of British Music. You could actually see how they linked their past or their traditions with contemporary culture. And there was actually this scene, I'm not quite sure if you remember, when you had like this military band playing Park Life. And I thought that's quite interesting because this massed band is usually when you have the changing of the guards, so it's associated with the Queen and quite this military tradition, but it's been in a quite playful way associated with Blair, which were at the same time actually playing a gig in Hyde Park at the same time. I think we don't have time for the music, but I want to conclude. So I think Britpop used cultural references in the lyrics and sounds, and the way they used it actually connected the contemporary culture of the younger generation with the cultural heritage of older generations. What I find quite interesting, quite a lot of the fans I talked to told me that their parents actually introduced them to Suede albums or to this kind of stuff, and led kind of to listening to older music like the Beatles, the Kings. And I had like one fan telling me when this whole hype was going on, her grandpa was asking her, "So which side are you on? Are you a Blur? Are you an Oasis fan? What is it?" So it was actually a topic at the time. And as we've seen in the imagery on Noel Gallagher's Union Jack guitar, there was kind of a common sense that Britpop had to reclaim the British flag from a nationalist negative to a more patriotic and positive use. And I actually argue at the end, that in contrast to the 60s bands who were selling British pop and identity to the world, I think Britpop bands sold it back to the British people. And yeah, that's where I want to end.
Thank you, Claudia. We'll go straight on to Sandra's paper. So, jumping forward about 15 years to, more like maybe 15 to 20 years to 2012 and the 2012 Olympics. So Sandra is based in the Department of Culture, Media and Creative Industries at King's College London, where she's currently undertaking a PhD on young people's anticipation of and memories of the Olympic Games, both in London for 2012 and over in Rio de Janeiro for 2016. And she's going to be talking today about young people's perceptions and memories of the London 2012 Olympics. So.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm going to read, so apologize and just bear with me. This is part of one of my sort of chapters from my research, where I will be exploring the memories of young people, or the intangible legacy of media events, by looking at young people's perceptions and memories of the London 2012 Olympic Games. So just to give a bit of context, what I'll try to talk today is to sort of talk about the media events and have a critical understanding how these events like the Olympic Games and Paralympic Games play a role in young people's notion of citizenship, values, cultural identity and national pride, and explore how young people's recollections and memories of this type of media are constructed and mediated in relation to the Games in London. From a media perspective, I will also try to provide a brief definition of media events and how these play a role in society's centre and national identity, by giving a brief historical context on the relationship between the Games and the media. And then finally, I will focus on the Games in London and its rhetoric towards the young population by addressing questions of legacy and remembrance. This is quite a new topic for me, memory, so there will probably not be, might not be very clear towards the end, so I would appreciate your feedback. So just to give a bit of context of the Olympic Games as a media, I think it's important to understand what are really media events. And media events are conceptually different from any other type of traditional genre, in that they represent themselves with specificities which do not fall entirely within the main categorization of media genres. Often called as performance or television ceremonies, this type of media creates a certain feeling of familiarism, or in other words, what Dayan and Katz describe as an attempt to stand for consensual values and command the audience's attention. They are pre-planned, presented with reverence and ceremony, during which the broadcaster transports us to the center of the sacred society. Unlike other television genres, media events are proposed by the organizers, like the Olympic Games, FIFA, governments and political parties, or other entities involved in the events, and subsequently shared by the broadcasters, who are responsible for the dissemination of the celebratory mode of the event. These organizations represent what Edward Schill calls a center, or a phenomenon consisting of the realm of values and beliefs, which embodies the pillars for consensual values and posit the fundamental beliefs in life that bind individuals together, so therefore carrying a certain authority to command the audience's attention. I would argue here that the center and these values is what established the core sense and feelings of national identity, particularly when trying to convey the best of a nation to a wider audience. The Olympic Games are staged by the International Olympic Committee, with the contribution of the National Olympic Committee and the organizing committee of the host city. The opening and closing ceremony is often associated with nationalist demonstration and, as some argue, an opportunity to tell a story of the nation to itself and the rest of the world. The difference between media events and other television genres, just to give a bit of a context, lies in the fact that the former presents itself in a celebratory format with the aim to integrate society in that collective mode, and by attempting to evoke a sense of loyalty to society's subliminal authority, whereas the other type of media genres, like news, do not require that level pre-planning, having therefore more input and control from the media side. The impact of media events may have on its audience and how these are remembered collectively is not so much related to how the events are staged, but rather how they are broadcasted. So the importance of the media in playing a key role in mediating the event between the organizers and the audience is really key. Television, and to a less extent radio, but also other mediums of communications, play a key role in the legacy, remembrance, and construction of collective memories of these events. In the case of the Olympic Games, television survives to all technological and digital media purely because it is still through this medium that much of the revenue is generated, creating therefore a market competition for sponsors, advertising agencies and broadcasters. As an example, the TV rights income of the Summer Olympic Games from 1960s to 2000, as you can see, explains the increasing relevance of television rights over these years, both in US and European TV. And there's a big jump there from 1980s to 84s with the Los Angeles Games. The relationship between the games and mass media has always been a contested one, in which the mass media held the upper hand for quite a long time, but not anymore. So this is the four distinct phases in this relationship between media and the Olympic Games. You can see the first one is the pre-television between 1884 and 1932, and then the television before satellites between 1936 and 64. The satellite television before the internet between 68 and 1988, and now the current era of the Olympic dominance from 1992 onwards. Part of the Olympic Games' success is owed to the potential and empowering technological advances of media, particularly the advent of television, which contributed and continues to promote much of the dissemination and promotion of the Olympic brand and movement. The first sport event to be broadcast in television was in fact the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin. Ever since then, the market and competition for television publicity, in tandem with the opportunity to showcase a country to the rest of the world, made the Olympic Games into one of the most desirable events for a nation to host. The bidding process, therefore, has become increasingly competitive over the years. And in order to reach out to a wider pool of audience, a shift in the Olympics coverage and related programs has occurred in television by merging with other genres of programming, therefore becoming something between infotainment, drama, current affairs, news, soap opera, including even mockumentaries such as the 2012 BBC series. Now, just to give a bit of a context of the London 2012 Games and the discourse towards young people, for the third time in history, the UK capital of London is selected by the International Committee to host the 2012 Summer Olympic and Paralympic Games. In a bid competition with four other major cities, Madrid, Moscow, New York and Paris, London was the favourite for the 2012 Games. In what was considered one of the most remarkable sporting events taking place in the UK in recent years, the Games' official discourse, particularly addressed at young people, was very much focused on a legacy of hope and inspiration, supported by the Olympic movement idea as a catalyst for positive change. This is the London Organising Committee speech. Right from the very beginning of our bid in 2003, London 2012 has been about what can be achieved through the inspiration and legacy of sport, and through the power, influence and values of the Olympic and Paralympic Games as a catalyst for positive change and inspiration for the youth of the world. Now, after years of detailed planning and preparations, all the foundations of our vision are in place, based around athletes, youth, legacy and transformation, London and the Games, the 5 pillars of the 2012 Games. Various initiatives were put together by the London Organising Committee, including to underpin the promise to inspire generation, including the Get Set programme, aimed at schools with activities related but not strictly just to sports. And this programme was not mandatory, but had a high level of participation from UK schools. The Youth Sports Trust was also aimed at young people, working in conjunction with other stakeholders towards defining a sporting legacy. And another governmental initiative was set up in 2008 called the Legacy Youth Panel, aiming to give adolescents from the 5 boroughs of the Olympic Games an opportunity to represent, assess, evaluate and comment on the legacy of the Games and impact in their neighbourhoods. In the post-Games period, also, the Culture Institute of King's College undertook a tracking study on the legacy of the Games in relation to the London Culture Programme, touching on some aspects inherent to this research, but not addressing matters related to cultural identity, nationalism and civic participation. Now, to focus on the Olympic legacy, legacy is clearly related to memory, and remembering is undoubtedly media influence. Media events such as this one will always remain one way or the other in the collective memory of its audience, either because of the traumas to which they are responses or exceptional nature and gratifications they provide. Legacy is perceived as a very slippery term and often assessed in quantitative rather than qualitative terms. Some theorists interpret the legacy talk around the Olympic Games as a smokescreen for wasteful and opportunistic expenditures on mega events as opposed to anything else, such as Ian McCrory, whereas others call for more in-depth analysis of the message constructed by the Olympic industry, especially in relation to companies and sponsors involved in the Games. Helen Lenski, for example, argues that the various programs put together by the Olympic committees for young people have had little scrutiny over the years by defending that often those messages' main goal is to influence young people through the embodiment of themes or ideologies that are of government interest, rather than serving the young audience needs. There seems to be, therefore, little evidence of studies that effectively assess the legacy of the Games in relation to citizenship values in general, and particularly in the case of the youth audience. The type of legacy brought to bear in this study is not a commodity one, but rather what I would call a social gift one. Instead of focusing on the cost, benefit, and economic angle of the legacies, I propose an analysis of the social culture, civic pride, for example, and relationships emerging from this type of event. Or what, again, Ian McCrory mentions, the cultural legacies of people's collective memories, both national and international, as relevant to the Olympic legacy. Throughout the bidding process until the end of the Games, the discourse from the UK government, including from Sebastian Lowe, the chairman of the London Organising Committee, was heavily focused on the young generation by urging for positive change within the youth population and calling for higher and better participation levels in sports, as well as maximising the opportunities of Olympic values for future and better citizenship. Ideals such as friendship, citizenship, cooperation, and equality were invoked as the key pillars of the Olympic values and therefore used to motivate change in society, including amongst its youngest members. And this is his speech just before the closing ceremony, where he says, young people will know that it is possible to achieve great things, to triumph over adversity, and to challenge and change their circumstances by dedicating themselves to a task and believing in themselves. This will keep the Olympic ideal alive for future generations until hopes of staging the Olympic Games begin to stir again, and we dream once more of welcoming you back to the Isles of Wonder. At the bidding process, London was also allowed 100 representatives in the voting hall, and in a bold move, bid leaders made sure that 30 of them were young people from the capital. With the motto Inspire a Generation, the aim was to use the Olympic to capitalize on mega events' effect, not just in sports, but also across other areas like health, culture, and education. However, and by contrast, when questioned about their first memories of the London Games, the young participants in this study, by and large, referred to symbols and icons of the Games as opposed to the values. So this is 3 examples that I extrapolated from the interviews. And the first one says, well, first thing that comes to my mind is the rings, the icons. Another participant said, no, I don't know who are the mascots, because we were asking about if they knew the meaning of the mascots and who they were. But I know that the Olympics were sponsored by Sainsbury's. I know because there was a lot of it in Sainsbury's. And the other one say, well, I think the values is something to do with no drugs or something like that. Isn't that one of the values? So, as I will discuss later, this demonstrates the influence of media in the process of constructing memories within a specific topic or matter. By addressing questions inherently related to how and what young people remember in relation to the 2012 Games, I argue here that this new approach of what I call an exploration of the intangible legacies of the Olympic Games and the rhetoric of this particular public in relation to the same is key to understand broader elements associated to concepts of national identity and cultural memory. Identity is a complex concept, and in the context of this study, I will be delimiting to the sociological approaches of the youth culture. Far from a simple definition, cultural identity is not transparent or unproblematic, but rather a production which is never completed and always constituted within, not outside, representation. Contrary to the view of young person as becoming rather than being, the approach here is on the young person as an active being capable of interpreting information and making sense of the world. Therefore, young people's remembrance are extremely valid in that they are the perspective that competes with historical narratives of the event, while also bringing a new dimension to the cultural identity praxis. Now, in the context of remembering the Olympic Games from young people's perspectives, it's important to note that since the 1920s, both in the UK and USA, there's been a significant concern in portraying and conveying mega-scale sporting events, including the Olympics, which provide a way of enhancing national identity and constructing national, public, and familiar private memories and narratives. In the UK, this was clearly perceived as an opportunity to inspire and promote values of citizenship, implying greater participation in the community, the enactment and active use of values such as friendship, equality, fair play, among many others shared by the Olympic global values. The work developed by Aleida and John Eastman in the late 80s is instrumental to underpin the theoretical concepts presented here on cultural memory. Drawing on from the work of the sociologist Maurice Halbach on collective memory, they explain there is a qualitative difference actually, between communicative and cultural memory. Communicative memory is based on all forms of communication and consisting of historical experience with a somewhat limited temporal horizon that could span from 80 to approximately 100 years. It has a strong link with the field of oral history, in which everyone is competent of remembering and interpreting the common past. Cultural memory, on the other hand, stands out as a more purposefully and ritualized form. What the authors argue is that what differentiates communicative from cultural memory is the everyday life, which is a communicative, to the temporal dimension of the festival, the cultural memory. Accordingly, cultural memory not only is the type of legacy brought to be here. Sorry, I think there's 6, 7, sorry. Yeah. I just got in. I was here, right? Okay, sorry. Cultural memory not only established with a specific meaning, but it's also conveyed with a ceremonial or ritual format by trained specialists, which in this case we could argue could be the International Olympic Committee or the London organizing committees for the Games. They are remembered as a ritual and ceremonial event and maintained and presented despite the different spectacles organized by the host cities. And they do this in such a way that it makes it a world-known event. Media events are electronic monuments, according to Dayan and Katz, and therefore a key player in the process of cultural memory, which would not exist without media. They provide a framework through which generations after generations rely upon as a reference to bridge personal and collective history. So this is just an example of a mind map exercise that I did with some of the kids. On a global scale, events like the Olympic Games are presented as a reference to viewers who are associated with different events in their lives. Their narration is also in competition with the writing of history, for example, in the way they are very so often conceptualized into films and other historical mini-series, like the television series that was made in honor of Jesse Owens and the Chariots of Fire film, which was famously associated to the theme of the Olympic Games. This synergy of ritualization with fictionalization explains why the recording of history itself is not the only way to remember, particularly when it comes to cultural memory. So cultural memory comprises of a body of reusable texts and rituals, specifically each society in each epoch, whose cultivation serves to convey the society's self-images. The narratives produced by young participants during this research, both written answers to questionnaires and drawings for the mind map exercises, are a reflection of the cultural memory. The fluidity of identity can be grounded in an act of retelling of the past, which, according to Stuart Hall, should not be undermined as they present imaginative productions of cultural identity. The opening spectacle of the Olympic Games, just to give an example, normally conveys a narrative related to the hosting nation's self-image. This is often presented as the best of a society. Nevertheless, I would argue that the way young people remember the Games is not exclusively based on such nationalistic discourses. Instead, the way they construct their memories also relies upon their daily experience, the outcome of such routines, and what the Halbach describes as the frameworks of social memory. According to him, who became famous for introducing the idea of collective memory in the 1920s, individual memories or recollections rely upon frameworks of social memory, or in other words, the various groups in societies who have the ability to collectively reconstruct their past. Below are just a few, this is just a few examples. I think I moved ahead. This is just a few examples of the what Maurice Albach understands as collective memory. So to discourse upon something means to connect within a single system of ideas, our opinions as well as those of the circle. It means to perceive in what happens to us in a particular application of facts concerning which social thought reminds us at the very moment of the meaning and impact of this, the impact these facts have for it. And this way, the framework of collective memory confines and bids our most intimate remembrance to each other. He also says that the dream is only based upon itself, whereas our recollections depend on those of all of our fellow and on the great frameworks of memory of society. And finally, at the moment of reproducing the past, our imagination remains under the influence of the present social milieu. In the process of how collective memories constitute and inform, individual memory is also shaped by media. So books, movies, photos, notes, among many other media objects, used by individuals as a reference for recollections and in order to remember events based on what they have heard or seen before, are all forms of media. So therefore, media is arguably also a framework through which experience and memory is shaped and constructed by individuals. And likewise, memories and recollections of the Olympic and Paralympic Games are conveyed and manifested through different media, including art across space and time. And these are just a few examples of graffitis. Similarly, this is particularly relevant when investigating young people's recollections of the games and the discourses that emerge from there, in that their memories are not strictly limited to television, the internet, or social frameworks. Conversations, images, books, photos, and other forms of media output, including artistic expressions, are also present in their discourse. Therefore, the feelings, opinions, and recollections of the games are formed and shaped by what I call media frameworks, similar to the social frameworks that Albach claimed shape collective memory. And remembering is an active process whereby the engagement with the past is more performative than a reproductive act, more about making sense of the present instead of simply retrieving past stories. These are just a few excerpts, again, from the interviews on different topics. For example, on the Paralympics, there was this sort of feeling that it was really important. As an example, somebody said, yes, if someone is disabled at school, people would come and help. The Paralympics have helped and show that side of things in schools. There was also a lot of discourse on gentrification, and I've just picked this one. For example, somebody said they opened the Westfield because of the Olympics, because, of the tourists. On sponsorship was quite a heated debate as well, because they had a very strong opinion about who should and shouldn't be sponsors. So they said, wasn't there a lot of uproar about McDonald's, like having a monopoly around, well, I can't remember, you couldn't buy chips, you couldn't buy fries or Coca-Cola around the stadium unless you was from McDonald's. A lot of people went very angry. Somebody also said it's stupid because if you're sponsoring a sports event with world-class athletes who don't eat at McDonald's, it's silly and contradictory. It doesn't make sense. And I personally think that McDonald's doesn't represent a culture. It's originally American, but it's worldwide known. It doesn't represent a culture. It's not British or American. It's just a business. Why didn't they do stalls of food originally from different parts of the world, like British food? Do you know what I mean? Culture memory is a dynamic process involving acts of remembrance and forgetting, through which individuals continuously reconfigure their relations with the past in order to make sense of the present. Based on interviews undertaken in London, the emphasis on young people's recollections is not so much about what is remembered, but instead how and why they recall particular elements as opposed to others, and most importantly, what is forgotten as part of identity formation of cultural identity. One of the 7 types of forgetting described by Paul Connerton as relevant to cultural memory and intrinsically related to this research is called structural amnesia. Structural amnesia, originally coined by John Barnes, implies that a person tends to remember only those things that are socially important to him or her. I would add that the relevance of such remembrance is intrinsically related to the present and reality in which that person lives. So it is not surprising, though, that certain elements closely associated to the games, such as the mascots or the Olympic Games, may not necessarily be the first recollections of young people, but instead remembrance such as the opening ceremony, particularly athletes, or even the daily disruptions of transports and the traffic that affected them. And this is evident not only the expected legacy imagined by the and this is evident not the expected legacy imagined by the organizing committee when addressing young people in its discourse. In general, media is not only a channel for dissemination or information, but a complex of a system of dynamics and a way of mediating and interconnecting in two ways, as instruments for sense-making between the individual and the world, as instruments for networking or mediating between individuals and groups. The Olympic Games would not be so well known globally if it wasn't for the role of media, particularly the television and the plethora of digital media, in accelerating dissemination of images and narratives. Andreas Jossen argues that the impact of global media on cultural memory, particularly in the Western world, has contributed to the increasing circulation of memory discourses, both at local and global level. This is also evident in the interviews from the research field work with participants in Rio de Janeiro. Although they will not experience the reality of the Games until next year, still the images and icons of certain athletes and other symbols inherent to the Games were very much present in their discourses, including stories circulated in the media in relation to the London 2012 Games. This transcultural view of memory can also be viewed and understood as a plethora of shared lieu of memory that emerged through the continual travel from media content, time and space across social, linguistic and political borders. And in this case, this is explicit in the combination of narratives on memories and expectations from different social, economic and national contexts. The voracious spread of print and image media make events like the Olympic Games known everywhere, even in locations where people do not have the opportunity for direct experience with the event. Media discourses, either about the particular event or news of the world, enable audience and citizens to feel and learn about it as if they were part of that experience. In other words, it creates a global culture of memory through which the new technologies and applications contribute to the formation of what Anna Redding says as a globital memory, in the sense that they replace the Maurice Albuch, the sort of social frameworks in a more globalized and digitized world. Bearing in mind the amount of media channels and technologies available nowadays, it does not come as a surprise that television may no longer be the only medium through which memories are constructed. With the advent of new technologies over the last decades, we have witnessed an exponential increase of other media platforms as alternatives to watch or get information about events. In today's digital and technological world, the way memories are mediated and constructed is no longer a straightforward process. And Joseph Van Dijk defines mediated memories as activities or objects that are produced through media technologies in order to recreate a sense of the past, the present, and the future of ourselves in relation to others. However, in the global technological advanced media world, there is no such thing as pure pre-medium. And this is where things get complicated. According to David Bolter and Richard Grusin, as media is caught up in the dynamics of its own, and in the same way that mediation is key to cultural memory, remediation is also fundamental to mediation. What these theorists defend is that all media is already a remediated representation of memory. Hoskin's concept of new memory and his reflections, particularly on remediation, are pertinent to this study, since the experience of the Games could either be experience of the real or experience of the medium. In either cases, and in the context of the Olympic Games, the act of watching it live on television is a remediation process through which the medium enables viewers to experience the immediacy of the event. The Games opening ceremony, for example, was a remediation of another mediated memory, like the Industrial Revolution, the NHS history. In the same way, when young participants drew the first ideas that came up to their minds as recollections of the Games, these recollections were a result of a mediation or remediation from previous media, particularly from all technological input that surrounds them daily. Many of them were unable to identify why certain images, as opposed to others, were more present in their memories, perhaps because they were already remediated. Another approach to mediated memories draws on from the powerful effect of mass media on cultural memory, in a phenomenon described by Alison Lambertsker as prosthetic memory, upon which mass media allows people to take on other people's experience and memories. In this case, although the participants had experienced the Games in their home country, Many reference to what they remember and how they remember is constructed and mediated from what they heard or seen or discussed with other people or in other people's accounts from the news and news technologies. This is also important for a better understanding of young people's expectations and imaginary of the games in preparation for my research in Brazil. For example, as mentioned before, many recurring elements in their discourse on the expectations about the games is very much based on what they heard about the games in London. What Landsberg brings into this term into the context of the experiential dimension of mediated memory to explain the power of mass culture in assisting people to experience or feel something similar to reality. Prosthetic memory emerges at the interface of a person and historical narrative of the past, at an experiential site. I would argue that talking about the games and undertaking the mind map exercise is in itself an experiential contact with history, as the participants recollect the spaces and icons associated to the games, including what they see or heard on the news and the facts they know about such event. The positive aspect of this so-called prosthetic memory in this context is that it produces empathy, but also feeling of a memory which was not lived directly. This concept made a significant contribution not only to the field of memory studies, but also to our understanding of media, resonating with McLuhan's argument that media functions as an extension of man. Other perspectives on the dynamics of mediated memories also draw attention to the difference between knowledge and memory. Peter Moosberg defends that the difference between remembering something and being remembered is relevant in the process of the establishment of cultural memories by suggesting that hegemonic elites have the power to distort memories in order to restrict counter-memories and manipulate cultural institutions and rituals in public spaces. Knowledge and memory are completely different things, but intricately merge and intertwine with each other. And accordingly, as mentioned before, memories are mediated, fostered, and they can also be restricted by social relations, movements, and power structures. Collective memories emerge from three types of sources, either imposed on people by state authorities, socially constructed and shared by groups, or based on personal experience by individuals belonging to a specific cohort. What Moosberg argues is that memory is a component of our orientation knowledge, forming part of identity, and therefore of key relevance and interest to politics. Throughout the history of the Olympic Games, there were numerous examples of such governmental propaganda. For example, the Berlin 1936, Mexico City 68, and Moscow 1980. Coincidentally, a great deal of what is remembered in relation to the Games in London is to a certain degree more related to what was in the media as opposed to the knowledge of the topic. For example, the meaning of the Olympic rings, the mascots, or the Olympism values coined and developed by Pierre de Coubertin. And this is just, again, a few examples when questioned about the meaning of the mascots. Somebody said Britpop was a toy, but it wasn't that one on a wheelchair. There was something like a movie with a rainbow, so they weren't quite sure about it. And the meaning of the 5 rings, I mean, some of them got it right, but they also thought it's like the logo and everyone remembers, but they recognized the symbol, but they didn't know the story behind it. On the Olympic values, they said, is it trying to make the Green Olympics and environmental friendly? Or again, you can't cheat, you can't take drugs. I've already mentioned that. So to summarize, in conclusion, unlike traditional assumptions that position young people as passive consumers of media, other critics conceive this audience as active consumers who are competent and active in their choices. The preliminary conclusions corroborate this, and in that young people are capable of critically articulate their views and opinions on topics that are perceived as only not just relevant to adults. For example, they can talk about sponsorship, the values of the Paralympics, and so on. By looking at sports history, there's always seemed to be a focus on identity and self-expression, particularly associated to national and local identities. However, perhaps due to the nature of this event, and in contrast to others like football, the Olympic Games' most remembered athletes tend to break that rule. Athletes like Jessica Ennis, Usain Bolt, and Mo Farah have one thing in common only for young people interviewed: the fact that they won medals at the 2012 Games. And this is the reason why they were the most mentioned names during the interviews, implying that the national identity or pride was not overtly manifested here, as it is sometimes in other sports. Although at this stage it's quite premature to establish any well-grounded and final conclusions, I would only go as far as to claim that there is little evidence so far of the utopian idea of an Olympism movement defended by Pierre de Coubertin and stressed by the London Organising Committee of the Olympic Games within the legacy left for young people in London. Thank you.
Of course, both our speakers.